cameras didn't catch this, but the fallout hit anyway. Because when Cynthia Bailey finally broke her silence, it wasn't with a vague quote or a polite deflection. It was with a chain reaction so explosive that fans immediately realized this was never meant to come out like this. Porsha Williams, alleged multiple affairs, whispers of a medical scare, and chaos so intense that people close to production are now saying certain moments were scrubbed before they ever aired. This wasn't shade. This wasn't tea. This was the kind of revelation that makes you stop mid-scroll and ask, wait, how long has this been building? According to what's now spreading across the internet, Cynthia didn't just expose behavior, she exposed patterns. Patterns that allegedly played out behind the scenes, off camera, and right under everyone's nose while viewers were being fed a much cleaner storyline. Insiders claim there were confrontations producers never wanted the audience to see, emotional breakdowns that didn't fit the narrative, and private concerns that suddenly turned public once Cynthia decided she was done protecting someone else's image at the expense of her own truth. And then came the part that made people uncomfortable. Not gossip, risk. Alleged concerns about health, responsibility, and choices that may have affected more than just reputations. That's when the conversation stopped being messy and started being serious. Because once medical implications enter the chat, even as allegations, the stakes change instantly. This wasn't about who did what with whom anymore. It was about accountability, trust, and what happens when reality can't be edited down to a soundbite. Social media erupted, fans split, old clips resurfaced with brand new meaning. And suddenly, moments that once looked playful felt tense. Forced. Off. People started asking whether Cynthia had been holding this in for years, waiting for the moment when silence became impossible. Because if even half of what's being whispered is true, then this wasn't a friendship fallout. It was a slow-burning implosion caught just late enough to do real damage. And the most chilling part, the people involved aren't denying that something went very wrong, they're just not saying how wrong yet. The moment this story surfaced, the temperature changed, not because of volume, but because of implication. Cynthia Bailey didn't go live swinging accusations. She didn't drop a tell-all interview naming dates and places. What she did, according to how this has been unfolding online, was something far more destabilizing. She withdrew protection. And when someone who's spent years smoothing things over decides to stop doing that, the silence they break feels louder than any rant ever could. For years, Cynthia and Porsha's dynamic appeared cordial on the surface. Professional, sometimes warm, sometimes strained, but never openly hostile. Viewers were shown laughter, group scenes, reconciliations that felt tidy enough to move the story forward. But insiders are now claiming that what played out on camera was only a fraction of what was happening off it, and that Cynthia, in particular, carried far more knowledge than she ever shared publicly. According to people close to production, the first fracture didn't come from a single argument. It came from patterns, repeated behavior, repeated explanations, repeated moments where Cynthia allegedly found herself covering, redirecting, or downplaying situations that didn't align with the image being presented. Not because she wanted to deceive viewers, but because, at the time, loyalty felt more important than exposure. That calculus, insiders say, eventually became impossible to maintain. The phrase that keeps coming up in discussions around Cynthia's comments is multiple situations. Not one affair, not one mistake, but a sequence of alleged overlaps that created tension behind the scenes long before viewers ever sensed it. People are careful to say alleged, but the consistency of the whispers is what made this land so hard. This wasn't framed as gossip Cynthia overheard. It was framed as behavior she claims to have witnessed the consequences of. What's especially unsettling is how fans are now rewatching old episodes with this new context in mind. Moments that once felt awkward now feel loaded. Pauses that seemed harmless now feel tense. Conversations that ended too quickly suddenly look edited, not for pacing, but for protection. And according to production insiders, there were scenes that never made it to air at all because they complicated the narrative too much. Then there's the on-camera chaos people are now talking about. Not the dramatic kind meant for ratings, but the kind producers actively try to avoid. Emotional spirals. Heated exchanges that didn't land as entertaining, but concerning. Moments where energy shifted so abruptly that filming had to pause. None of this has been confirmed publicly, but multiple accounts describe a pattern of instability that didn't fit the version of events viewers were meant to follow. The most delicate part of Cynthia's alleged revelations is the health conversation, And it's the reason this story made so many people uncomfortable so quickly. Not because specific diagnoses were named, they weren't, but because concerns were raised about responsibility, risk, and how private choices can have broader consequences. Importantly, nothing concrete has been confirmed. No medical records, no official statements, just the implication that Cynthia felt something crossed from personal business into potential harm. And that distinction matters. Because when friends start worrying not just about reputations, but about safety and accountability, the tone shifts entirely. This stops being reality TV mess and starts being real-life tension that cameras aren't equipped to handle responsibly. Insiders say this was the moment Cynthia allegedly realized she could no longer stay quiet without feeling complicit in a narrative that didn't reflect her reality. Social media reacted in waves. The first wave was shock. The second was denial. The third was recontextualization. Old interviews resurfaced. Side comments took on new meaning. Fans noticed how often Cynthia had looked exhausted rather than entertained in scenes involving Porsha. How often she redirected conversations. How often she played peacekeeper when it wasn't her fight. Those moments, once seen as maturity, are now being read as containment. To be clear, none of this is proven fact. It is a story unfolding through implication, timing, and changing alliances, not sworn statements. But in celebrity culture, implication from someone perceived as credible can be just as destabilizing as documentation. Cynthia has long been viewed as measured, cautious, and conflict-averse, which is why her decision to stop protecting a version of events has people paying attention. What makes this first phase especially volatile is that no one has rushed to shut it down. There's been no sweeping denial addressing every point, no legal threat waived publicly, no immediate attempt to rewrite the narrative. Instead, there's been silence, and in situations like this, silence invites interpretation whether it's fair or not. At its core, this isn't yet a story about guilt or innocence. It's a story about fractured trust, about what happens when someone decides they're done carrying weight that isn't theirs, and about how much of what we see on screen is curated not just for drama, but for damage control. This chapter ends without answers, but with a clear shift. Whatever Cynthia knows, she's no longer willing to pretend it didn't exist. And whatever Porsha is dealing with, it's no longer confined to edited scenes and controlled narratives. The protective layer has cracked. And once that happens, the rest of the story doesn't usually stay hidden for long. As this story moved into its second phase, the conversation stopped being about what Cynthia said and started being about why she finally said anything at all. Because the more people sat with it, the clearer it became that this wasn't a spontaneous spill or a clout grab. It felt like the aftermath of years of restraint finally collapsing under its own weight. And that realization made everything feel heavier. Insiders began framing Cynthia's shift not as an exposure, but as a refusal to continue absorbing consequences that weren't hers. For a long time, Cynthia was seen as the calm one, the stabilizer, the person who smoothed tensions, reframed situations, and kept the group moving forward even when dynamics behind the scenes were deteriorating. But according to multiple accounts, that role came at a cost. Because protecting someone else's narrative often means erasing your own experience in the process. What sharpened the tension in this phase was the growing sense that Cynthia's silence had been misinterpreted as agreement. That because she didn't speak publicly, people assumed she didn't see, didn't know, or didn't care. And when that assumption hardened into public belief, it quietly placed responsibility on her shoulders for things she allegedly had no control over. That's when silence stops being neutral and starts becoming a liability. This is where the conversation around alleged multiple affairs became more complicated. Cynthia didn't present them as shocking revelations. According to those close to her, she referenced them as ongoing issues that had ripple effects, trust issues, emotional fallout, group tension, that she was repeatedly asked to help manage. Not confirm, not excuse, manage. And there's a difference. Being adjacent to chaos doesn't mean you endorse it, but it does mean you're often expected to help clean it up. Fans began noticing how often Cynthia was positioned as the mediator in conflicts that didn't originate with her. How often she was expected to be understanding, forgiving, patient. How rarely her discomfort was centered. With new context, those moments no longer looked like emotional intelligence alone, they looked like burden. And burdens eventually break people down. The most uncomfortable element of this phase was how the medical risk conversation was being handled, or rather, not handled. Cynthia did not name conditions. She did not present diagnoses. She did not disclose records. And that restraint mattered. What she allegedly referenced were concerns, the kind that arise when private behavior intersects with responsibility to others. And that's a line many people struggle with. When does respecting someone's privacy become enabling risk? This is where viewers and commentators began to diverge sharply. Some accused Cynthia of implying too much without proof. Others argued that her restraint was exactly the point, that she stopped short of details because the issue wasn't gossip, it was ethics. According to this reading, Cynthia wasn't trying to expose anyone's health. She was explaining why she could no longer pretend everything was fine when it didn't feel that way privately. Meanwhile, production whispers grew louder. Not confirmations, but patterns. Claims that certain scenes were heavily edited. That confrontations were softened. That emotional intensity was redirected into safer storylines. Reality television thrives on drama, but it avoids anything that feels legally or morally radioactive. And if concerns about safety or accountability surfaced during filming, it would make sense that they'd be quietly rerouted rather than aired. What unsettled fans most during this phase was how much suddenly made sense. Why certain storylines felt abruptly dropped. Why certain friendships seemed to cool without explanation. Why Cynthia appeared more detached in later group scenes. Why her energy shifted from engagement to endurance. Those weren't moments viewers clocked in real time, but in hindsight, they formed a pattern that felt hard to ignore. Social media discourse intensified, but it also matured. Fewer jokes, fewer memes, more careful language. People began acknowledging that this wasn't about dragging Porsha, it was about understanding why Cynthia drew a line. And that distinction mattered, because drawing a line doesn't automatically make the other person guilty. It means the relationship dynamic became unsustainable. The silence from Porsha during this phase added another layer of tension. Not because silence implies guilt, it doesn't, but because the absence of a clear counter-narrative left space for interpretation. And interpretation thrives in uncertainty. Fans debated whether responding would inflame things or clarify them, whether denial would help or hurt, and whether this was being handled privately, where it arguably belonged. What also became clear is that both women were navigating competing risks. Cynthia risked being seen as disloyal for speaking at all. Porsha risked amplifying speculation by responding. Neither option offered clean resolution. And when all available moves carry consequences, people often choose restraint, even if that restraint gets misread. By the end of this phase, the story had shifted decisively. It was no longer framed as Cynthia exposing Porsha. It was framed as Cynthia exiting a role she no longer consented to play. The role of buffer, of fixer, of silent witness. And that exit destabilized the entire narrative because it removed the person who had been quietly holding things together. No facts were confirmed, no accusations were proven. But one truth stood out clearly: whatever was happening behind the scenes had reached a point where silence felt more harmful than honesty, at least to Cynthia. And once someone reaches that conclusion, relationships rarely return to their previous form. This phase didn't bring answers. It brought clarity of tension. And it set the stage for a final, unavoidable question. When truth and loyalty collide, who gets protected, and at what cost? By the time this story reached its third phase, the chaos wasn't coming from new claims. It was coming from what the absence of clarification had already done. At this point, no one was waiting for a shocking receipt or a dramatic reveal. What people were sitting with instead was discomfort. The kind that comes when a narrative cracks open just enough to expose how much has been left unsaid and how intentional that silence might actually be. What became increasingly clear is that Cynthia's decision to stop cushioning the situation wasn't about retaliation, it was about self-preservation. For years, she occupied a role that required emotional labor without public credit. The calm one, the neutral one, the one expected to absorb tension so others didn't have to. And while that role can look graceful from the outside, it's often corrosive on the inside, especially when the issues being smoothed over are no longer small, private, or harmless. This phase forced many fans to confront an uncomfortable truth about reality television. Not all silence is ignorance, and not all exposure is cruelty. Sometimes silence is survival. And sometimes speaking up is the only way to step out of a dynamic that has quietly become unsafe, emotionally, ethically, or psychologically. Cynthia's shift seemed to reflect that realization. Not a desire to burn bridges, but a refusal to keep standing on one that was already cracking. The conversation around alleged affairs, by this point, had lost its sensational edge. People weren't counting numbers or speculating about names. Instead, the focus shifted to impact. How repeated breaches of trust, real or perceived, affect group dynamics. Reminder: none of these claims have been proven, and speculation does not equal fact. But the emotional consequences of believing something is happening can be just as destabilizing as the act itself. And Cynthia, according to those close to her, was tired of carrying the emotional weight of managing fallout she didn't create. The medical risk implication remained the most sensitive and least defined part of the story, and that ambiguity was intentional. Cynthia did not, at any point, present medical information, diagnoses, or documentation. She did not name conditions or disclose private details. What she allegedly referenced were concerns, not facts, the kind that arise when behavior intersects with responsibility to others and begins to feel ethically fraught. That distinction is critical. Raising concern is not the same as making an accusation, but it is often treated that way in public discourse. By now, many viewers began to understand why producers might have struggled with this material. Reality television thrives on conflict, but it draws a hard line at anything that could imply harm, liability, or ethical exposure. If scenes veered too close to those territories, editing them out wouldn't be deception, it would be risk management. And that realization reframed how people interpreted what they hadn't seen just as much as what they had. Porsha's continued silence during this phase became less of a mystery and more of a strategy, not in a manipulative sense, but a protective one. Responding publicly to implication can backfire, especially when the claims are vague and the stakes are high. Any denial risks amplifying speculation. Any clarification risks opening doors that can't be closed. In situations like this, silence can be the least damaging option, even if it's emotionally unsatisfying for an audience craving closure. What changed most in this phase was the audience's posture. The loudest reactions softened. The certainty faded. People began acknowledging that they were only seeing fragments, edited scenes, second-hand accounts, carefully worded implications. And with that acknowledgement came a quieter question: what is our role here? Are we seeking truth, or are we consuming discomfort because it feels like access? Cynthia's position, by now, was understood less as accusatory and more as boundary setting. She didn't push the story forward. She didn't escalate. She didn't follow up with additional hints. She simply stopped protecting a narrative that no longer felt aligned with her reality. And that choice, to disengage rather than expose, is often misunderstood in celebrity culture, where silence is read as strategy and speech is read as attack. In reality, both can be acts of self-care. The fallout, however, was unavoidable. Once protection is withdrawn, narratives destabilize. People notice inconsistencies they once ignored. Energy shifts that once felt subtle become obvious. And relationships that once seemed functional suddenly feel strained. That doesn't mean anyone is guilty of what's been implied. It means the system that kept everything looking cohesive has changed. As this chapter closed, one thing became evident. This story was never going to end with a definitive answer. There would be no neat confession, no dramatic denial that erased doubt, no reunion scene that reset the dynamic. What it would end with instead is recalibration. Cynthia stepping out of a role that cost her peace, Porsha navigating scrutiny without fueling it, and an audience left to reckon with how much of what they watch is shaped by what people choose not to say. This isn't a story about villains and victims. It's a story about boundaries, perception, and the cost of carrying silence for too long. It's about how implication can destabilize even without proof, and how responsibility doesn't always look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like stepping back and letting the truth, whatever it may be, exist without your constant mediation. In the end, the chaos wasn't created by Cynthia speaking up. It was created by the realization that she had been holding things together far longer than anyone realized. And once that support was removed, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Before you click away, understand this: moments like this don't unravel all at once. They settle. They reshape how people see past scenes, past friendships, past silences. And once that shift happens, there's no going back to the clean version of the story we were originally shown. If you stayed through this, it means you picked up on what really mattered here. Not shock value, not rumors, but the cost of carrying silence and the moment someone decides they're done doing that. This wasn't about dragging anyone for sport. It was about boundaries, pressure, and what happens when curated narratives start to crack under real-life weight. So don't just watch and disappear. Like this video so thoughtful breakdowns don't get buried under reaction bait. Comment with what you noticed, because the comment section is where patterns get connected and details others missed come into focus. And subscribe now, because stories like this don't end with one moment. They echo. And the next shift will make a lot more sense if you've been paying attention from the beginning. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding how power, silence, and responsibility actually play out when the cameras stop rolling. Stay locked in, because the quiet moments usually tell you more than the loud ones ever could.